Now, the chain housing to block stud must be installed and tightened to specification. This stud is the pivot for the timing chain tensioner shoe. The timing chain tensioner assembly must now be reloaded to its correct position. First, assemble the restraint cylinder, spring, and nylon plug into the plunger. Index the slot in the restraint cylinder with the peg in the plunger. Push and rotate the restraint cylinder clockwise into the plunger until it bottoms and locks on the peg. The pin in the plunger will lock the restraint in the loaded position. Install the anti-release device tool onto the plunger assembly. This will prevent the tensioner from releasing during installation. Now, position the tensioner assembly in the chain housing. Recheck the plunger assembly installation. It is correctly installed when the long end is toward the crankshaft. Install the timing chain tensioner bolts and tighten them to specification. Next, install the tensioner shoe. Remove the anti-release device. The timing chain tensioner spring and retainer are installed next. Squeeze the plunger assembly into the tensioner body. This will unload the plunger assembly. Now, lower the car and remove the alignment dowel pins. Rotate the crankshaft clockwise 2 full rotations. Align the crankshaft timing mark with the mark on the cylinder block and reinstall the alignment dowel pins. The pins will slide in easily if the engine is timed correctly. If the engine is not timed correctly, severe engine damage could occur. The 3 timing chain guides are installed next. And finally, install the crankshaft oil slinger. Insert new gaskets Put the chain housing cover in position and reinstall the fasteners. Then install the engine lift hook. Next, lubricate and install the crankshaft harmonic balancer. The torque angle specification on that bolt is 100 Newton meters or 74 pounds-feet plus 90 degrees. Caution: use of the torque angle meter to tighten the harmonic balancer bolt can permanently damage the meter. The torque angle specification on this bolt will exceed the half-inch drive's load limit. A 3/4-inch drive must be used for this bolt. Install the harmonic balancer holder. To achieve the correct torque angle specification, first tighten the bolt to 100 Newton meters or 74 pounds-feet. Notice the marks on the holder. Scribe a mark on the socket adjacent to one of the marks on the holder. Now rotate the bolt 90 degrees or until the mark on the socket aligns with the next mark on the holder. Now, the serpentine belt can be threaded in place. Observe the indicator mark on the stationary portion of the tensioner and the slotted area on the movable portion of the tensioner. Refer to the service manual or the booklet accompanying this video for interpretation of these indicators. Install the belt tension gauge halfway between the generator and the air conditioning compressor. The lower leg of the tool should be parallel with the belt. Refer to the service manual for the serpentine belt tension checking procedure. Raise the car and reinstall the splash shield. The installation of the water pump requires a special sequence. Following the tightening procedure will ensure proper sealing and will prevent component damage. Loosening the two fasteners that hold the radiator outlet tube to the oil pan and the transaxle case will prevent the tube from cracking when the water pump is reinstalled. Before the pump goes on, you must install a new gasket onto the back of the timing chain housing. Then, lubricate the water pump splines with high-temperature wheel bearing grease or equivalent. Now, install the pump onto the 3 studs holding the pump body to the chain housing. Install 3 nuts onto these studs just tight enough to close the gap between the pump body and the chain housing. Next, install a new O-ring onto the inlet tube. Lubricate it with coolant solution. Put both gaskets onto the pump cover. And install the pump cover onto the tube. Then, loosely install the 5 bolts that hold the pump cover to the body. These bolts should be just tight enough to close the gap between the cover and body. Loosely install the 2 bolts that hold the pump cover to the block. Again, just tight enough to close the gap. Now you can torque the 3 nuts on the studs, then the 5 bolts holding the pump cover to the pump body. Next, torque the 2 bolts holding the pump cover to the block. Finally, tighten the 2 bolts that hold the tube to the pump. The exhaust manifold gasket and exhaust manifold can be reinstalled at this point. Here is the sequence for tightening the manifold bolts. When the exhaust manifold is in place, install the heat shield. The intake manifold can be reinstalled next. Begin with a new intake manifold gasket. The numbers stamped on the gasket should face toward the manifold surface. Here is the sequence for tightening these bolts. Now, install the intake manifold brace. Now, the fuel rail can be installed. Remove the injector covers. Check the O-rings and lubricate them with clean engine oil. Install a new O-ring on the end of the oil level indicator tube, lubricate it with engine oil, and install the tube. Next, the oil-air separator can be installed. Now install the spark plugs and torque them to specification. Carefully position the ignition assembly cover onto the spark plugs and bolt the cover in place. Add the correct amount of engine oil. Before adding coolant, remove the upper heater hose from the thermostat housing. Fill the radiator with coolant. Any trapped air will escape through the upper hose. When coolant reaches the upper heater hose, reinstall the hose and complete filling the system. The engine is now completely reassembled. Reconnect all of the electrical connectors. Proper routing of the oxygen sensor wire keeps it away from the exhaust system and prevents it from being snagged by the steering gear. Start the engine and run it at idle for 5 minutes. Then increase the speed to 2,000 RPM until the coolant reaches 90 degrees centigrade. Make certain all systems are operating properly.